Hi, Kenny Shu. I heard some things about the admission rates being different between Asian American boys and Asian American girls. Is there a significant difference in gender for admission rates? And what do you think explains that? Or if there is there?
There is, but it's not significant. I think Rick would be in a better position as a, number one, real lawyer, and number two, real economist to answer this. But I'll tell you something that came out during the last 5 years that I think is very interesting and very revelatory. Harvard, along with most competitive universities, gets information about students' PSAT scores. And using those PSAT scores, we'll send letters to hundreds, thousands of kids throughout the country, encouraging them to apply to Harvard or to Yale or Princeton or Stanford. It was interesting this came out. In certain parts of the United States, what Harvard calls sparse country, these are states that have relatively small populations, there are different bright lines that Harvard uses to send these letters of encouragement to apply. For African Americans and Hispanics and whites in these states, a PSAT score of 1100 will get you a letter of encouragement to apply. In those states, an Asian American girl scoring 1350 will get a letter, yet an Asian American boy has to score 1380 in order to get a letter. So I think that gives you a little bit of an idea of the overall theme that Harvard and other, I assume, competitive universities are using. Rick?
Yeah, and I would add that I think gender probably plays some role. A lot of the data that I analyze doesn't have gender, so I actually can't say definitively. But I think it's a very secondary factor compared to race. What is most striking and I think very disturbing is that for the very elite schools, and this carries over to a lot of graduate education, there's a really large racial gap for African Americans. African American women are often outnumber African American men by something like 2 to 1 in these programs. So the problems that are affecting African American achievement are weighing particularly heavily on males, and something we need to pay attention to.
Yes, I have a question regarding, I believe it's proposed and not adopted yet, but the new adversity score regarding the SAT. I want to know what impact you think that will have and how that will play out.
You should talk about this.
Well, it's exciting and concerning simultaneously. For those of us who have argued that we should try to pay more attention to socioeconomic disadvantage, this is a recognition by the College Board that that's important, and they're trying to provide a systematic way of doing that. The question is this index constructed mainly as a way of trying to show how much people's performance is understated, how much their potential is understated by their life disadvantage? Or is it mainly driven by attempts to do reverse engineering of racial preferences? And the way to answer that question is to get data, both on how they've developed this and on a cross section of students, and see, College Board must have this, actual outcome data and actual background data, and let's see what's really going on. So far, the College Board is not showing much inclination to be transparent, and the fact that they're not providing these scores to the students who are taking the tests is not encouraging.
History can inform us, right, to some extent. There's a parallel in the voting rights arena, right, from several decades prior, which, like Rick, I think it's fair to say, we can be cautiously optimistic that this is an effort to move beyond race and to focus on socioeconomics. But the pessimist in me looks at the public statements made by the College Board, the pressures put on the College Board, right? The efforts to focus on skin deep diversity, right? And my gut is saying that, like the segregationists and the racists of the past, the way that these allegedly race-neutral programs will be implemented, the way that they were designed, is to achieve a racial result. And we won't be able to prove this, right, until the actual results come out. And I think the College Board is very well advised by legal counsel to try to do everything possible to keep the data hidden, maybe not even keep the data for very long. And we may very well need to dust off and start applying some legal theories that were used by the NAACP, by other civil rights groups in decades past to use statistical disparities to challenge, I think, many of these allegedly race-neutral programs. I'm not very optimistic about it based on their public statements.
I only have one small thing to add to this, and that is I've had some discussions with lawyers who are very knowledgeable about FERPA. I don't know exactly what FERPA stands for. Do you recall what that is?
Federal Education Reporting Practices Act.
Excellent, good. I'm comforted by being next to two Harvard guys. So FERPA, it's likely that FERPA will compel a university to disclose to a student who is attending that school that information. So I don't think the College Board's going to be able to keep this completely under wraps as long as FERPA can be brought into play.
So, final question, and then we move to keynote speech.
Thank you, Ying Ma. A lot of Asian American proponents of affirmative action often say that certain Asian American groups, in fact, need affirmative action more than others, who specifically Laotians, Cambodians, Vietnamese tend to be the groups they point to. I'm wondering whether it's for the Harvard case or Professor Sanders in the research that you do, what sort of preferences, if any, do you see these universities giving to those groups over groups such as Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, or Korean Americans? Or do you see any disparities at all?
Yes. There's, the Harvard data, unfortunately, is under seal, so it can't be used for general public analysis. But the information that we have, the sort of information that has been provided for analysts from a variety of sources, consistently shows that when schools have a large enough number of Asian applicants that they can sort of meaningfully do disparate treatment among Asian Americans, they do. And they have a hierarchy of penalties and preferences across ethnicities. So generally, subcontinent Asians and East Asians experience the largest penalties. Southeast Asians, smaller ones, Pacific Islanders often receive a preference. It varies from school to school, but yes, these institutions are quite elaborate in the way they use race.
Are you able to sort of elaborate a little bit more on just exactly how big the disparities are, or is it just very different from, across the top schools?
I would say that frequently the difference between Chinese American and Vietnamese American is as large as the difference between Vietnamese American and white, for example, or larger.
I actually was wondering, do they apply these disparities within other groups, right? For example, there's been scholarship about the benefit of a racial preference in the African American community, and the benefits going overwhelmingly or significantly to Black Americans who are not of American descent, who are immigrants or immigrant children.
Well, yeah, there was a whole scam that a lot of the elite universities followed for many years, where they wanted to have a certain number that they could say, we're 9% Black. And it turned out that 2/3 of their quote unquote blacks were either from Africa or the Caribbean, or were the children of immigrants, or were biracial. And only about 1/3 of the 9% had 4 grandparents of African American origin. The education department tightened up on the reporting requirements for this several years ago. So those practices have been modified some, but it's still very much a phenomenon out there. So it's, this ties into what Edward said about the use of socioeconomic status in African American admissions, where it's, a disadvantage to be poor if you're black and applying to Harvard. It's incredibly cynical, frankly, the way that the universities are focused on having a good public relations outcome, and they're not focused on good substantive outcomes.